The scissors were still in her stepmother's hand when the carriage arrived. No one thought to hide them. No one thought it mattered. No one, it seemed, had considered the possibility that a man like the Duke of Ashford would ever look closely enough at a girl like Cecilia Vane to notice what had been taken from her. They were wrong. But Cecilia didn't know that yet. She was still standing in the middle of her childhood bedroom, staring at the floor, watching the last of her hair settle against the cold stone like something that had quietly given up. Her hands were at her sides. Her back was straight. She had learned over many years in that house that crying in front of Lady Harwick only made things last longer. So she didn't cry. She simply looked at what was left of herself on the floor, picked up her worn travel bag, and walked out the door without being asked. The carriage was waiting, so was everything she didn't yet know was coming. It had begun, as most cruelties in that house did, with a perfectly reasonable explanation. "You look wild," Lady Harwick had said that morning, setting down her teacup with the particular precision of a woman who had rehearsed the conversation. "Untamed. It won't do. Not where you're going." Where Cecilia was going was Ashford Estate, seat of Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Ashford, a man whose name appeared in the society pages with the kind of regularity that suggested either great importance or great scandal. In this case, both. He was 31, unmarried and reportedly uninterested in changing either of those facts. He had inherited the dukedom at 19 after his father's sudden death, had managed his estates with cold efficiency ever since, and was known in London drawing rooms primarily for two things: his fortune and his complete indifference to what anyone thought of it. He was not, by any account, a man who needed anything from the Harwick family, which made the arrangement all the more confusing to Cecilia. She had been told very little, only that her late father, Sir Arthur Vane, had left certain instructions regarding her future, and that those instructions involved the Duke, and that she was to go quietly and cause no trouble and be grateful. Lady Harwick had delivered this information 3 days ago over breakfast, in the same tone she used to discuss household accounts, flat, efficient, and entirely closed to questions. Cecilia had asked one anyway. "What instructions?" Lady Harwick had looked at her over the rim of her cup, the kind that are no longer your concern to understand, only to obey. That had been the end of the conversation. And so that morning, with the carriage already at the gate and the driver waiting, and the two housemaids pretending to be very busy with things that did not require their attention at all, Lady Harwick had come to Cecilia's room with a pair of long-handled scissors and a look that said the decision had already been made. "Sit down. My hair is perfectly." "Sit down." Cecilia had sat. She had thick hair, dark and heavy, the kind that fell past her shoulder blades when loose and had taken years to grow. Her mother had loved it, had brushed it every evening before bed when Cecilia was small, counting the strokes aloud, losing count on purpose so they could start again. It was one of the few memories Cecilia still kept close, worn smooth from handling, like a stone carried too long in a pocket. Lady Harwick had not been gentle. She hadn't been deliberately brutal either. That was almost worse. She had simply cut, with the focused, detached efficiency of someone trimming a hedge that had grown inconveniently large, strand by strand, section by section, until what remained barely brushed Cecilia's jaw on one side and sat an inch shorter on the other, uneven in a way that would be obvious to anyone who looked. Cecilia had not moved, had not spoken, had stared at the water-spotted mirror across the room and watched herself disappear by degrees and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "She is afraid of something." Not of Cecilia, exactly. Lady Harwick had never been afraid of Cecilia, but of something Cecilia represented, something about the Duke, or the estate, or the arrangement that no one would explain properly. Something that made a grown woman of considerable social standing pick up a pair of scissors on a Tuesday morning and use them on her stepdaughter's hair like it was the most natural thing in the world. "What are you afraid I'll do?" Cecilia had thought. "What do you think he'll see?" She hadn't asked. There was no point. Lady Harwick was already stepping back, examining her work with a slight tilt of her head, apparently satisfied. "That's better," she had said, "more appropriate." For what, she didn't say. For what, Cecilia was only beginning to wonder. The carriage ride to Ashford Estate took the better part of 4 hours, through countryside that grew steadily greener and quieter as London fell behind. Cecilia sat with her bag on her lap and her eyes on the window, and her mind turning the same questions over and over without arriving anywhere useful. Her father had been dead for 2 years. She had not been permitted to attend the funeral. She had not been shown the will. She had been told, simply, that everything had been settled and that she was to trust Lady Harwick's guidance and be thankful for the roof over her head. She had done all of those things, or at least performed them convincingly enough that no one had thought to look more closely. But her father had left instructions, involving the Duke, and whatever those instructions were, Lady Harwick had spent 2 years not mentioning them, and had only produced them now, and had chosen, on the morning of Cecilia's departure, to take a pair of scissors to her hair. That was not the action of a woman who was confident. That was the action of a woman who was trying to solve a problem she didn't entirely understand. The carriage turned through iron gates, and Cecilia sat up slightly despite herself. Ashford Estate emerged from the tree line the way certain things do in dreams, gradually, and then all at once. The main house was older than she'd expected, built from pale gray stone that had darkened at the edges with age, its windows tall and numerous, catching the late afternoon light in a way that made the whole facade seem to shift slightly as the carriage moved. The grounds were immaculate but not ostentatious. No fountains, no theatrical gardens. Just long, clean lawns and old trees, and the particular stillness of a place that had been standing long enough not to feel the need to prove anything. Cecilia looked at it and felt, unexpectedly, something loosen in her chest. She didn't know why. She had never been here, had never, to her knowledge, had any connection to this estate or the family that owned it. And yet, "I knew something was wrong the moment I saw your hair." She didn't know those words yet, didn't know they were coming or who would say them or what they would cost him to admit. She only knew that the carriage was slowing, and the door was about to open, and whatever her stepmother had been afraid of was waiting somewhere inside that house. She picked up her bag. She straightened her back. She stepped out into the light. She had expected a butler. Most great houses operated that way. The Duke himself would be somewhere distant and important, and a senior member of staff would receive her at the door with practiced neutrality and lead her through corridors she wasn't supposed to admire too openly, and she would be shown to a room and told the rules, and that would be that. She had prepared herself for it, had arranged her expression accordingly on the carriage ride up the drive, polite, unremarkable, the particular blankness of a woman who did not intend to be noticed. What she had not prepared for was the man standing at the top of the stone steps. He was tall, taller than she'd expected, though she wasn't sure what she had expected, exactly. The society pages offered descriptions that were either too flattering or too careful to be useful. What they had not conveyed was the stillness of him. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, and watched the carriage arrive with the expression of someone who had been waiting, not impatiently, but with the focused attention of a man accustomed to gathering information before he spoke. Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Ashford, was not what the drawing rooms of London had led her to believe. He was not handsome in the easy, approachable way of men who knew it and used it. He was something more unsettling than that, sharp-featured and dark-eyed, with the kind of face that rewarded a second look more than a first. There was nothing soft about him. But there was, Cecilia noticed as the carriage door opened, and she stepped down into the gravel, nothing performative either. He was not arranging himself for her benefit. He was simply there, watching, in the way that certain people watch when they are genuinely trying to understand something. She was used to being looked at and dismissed. She was not used to being looked at like that. The housekeeper, Mrs. Polden, appeared at his left shoulder, a small, brisk woman of 60 with silver hair and the expression of someone who managed large problems quietly and preferred it that way. She stepped forward first, as protocol required. "Miss Vane," she said, "welcome to Ashford Estate. I am Mrs. Polden. We have prepared the East Wing guest room for your—" "Miss Vane." The Duke's voice was quiet. That was the first thing she noticed about it. Not cold, precisely, but contained, the voice of a man who did not raise it because he had never needed to. Cecilia looked at him. He was looking at her hair. Not the way Lady Harwick's housemaids had looked at it that morning, with the careful avoidance of people who have witnessed something uncomfortable and chosen not to acknowledge it. He was looking at it directly, with a slight narrowing of his eyes, the way a person looks when they are confirming something they have already begun to suspect. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. To Cecilia, it felt considerably longer. "Your Grace," she said, because someone had to say something, and she had the distinct impression it was going to have to be her. He didn't respond immediately. His gaze moved from her hair to her face, and whatever he found there, the straightness of her posture perhaps, or the particular set of her jaw that her father had once called stubbornly dignified, seemed to settle something in him. He gave a short nod, as though she had answered a question she hadn't known he was asking. Then he said it. "Who did that to your hair?" The question landed in the courtyard and stayed there. Mrs. Polden went very still. The young footman who had come to collect Cecilia's bag found something extremely interesting to examine on the middle distance. 2 upstairs maids who had drifted to a window above, curious, as staff always are about arrivals, disappeared from view with a speed that suggested they had heard the Duke's tone before and knew what it meant. Cecilia did not look away from him. She had a choice in that moment. She could deflect, "Oh, it was simply more practical for travel," or minimize, "It's of no consequence, Your Grace," or redirect entirely, which was what Lady Harwick would have done, turning the question back on itself so smoothly that the asker forgot they had asked it. She chose none of those things. Not because she was brave, exactly, but because something about the directness of the question demanded a directness in return. He had not asked it to be polite. He had not asked it to make conversation. He had asked it because he wanted to know, and he was looking at her in a way that suggested he had a reasonably good idea of the answer already and was giving her the opportunity to confirm it. "It doesn't matter, Your Grace," she said. It was not a lie. It was not quite the truth. He looked at her for a long moment. "It does to me," he said. And then, before she could respond, before she could decide what on earth a person was supposed to say to that, he turned to Mrs. Polden and spoke quietly for a moment about something to do with the East Wing fire being lit early, the evenings having turned cold. Perfectly ordinary, entirely composed. As though he had not just said something that Cecilia would still be turning over in her mind 3 hours later, sitting alone in a guest room that was finer than any she had slept in, staring at the ceiling and trying to work out what kind of man noticed a thing like that. Mrs. Polden showed her upstairs herself, which Cecilia gathered was not the usual arrangement. The housekeeper said nothing about the hair, said nothing about the Duke or his question, or the particular quality of silence that had followed it. She simply led Cecilia through corridors that smelled of beeswax and old books, pointed out the relevant doors, the bathroom, the linen closet, the back staircase she was welcome to use, and deposited her in a large, well-appointed room with a fire already beginning to catch, and a window that looked out over the east lawn toward a stand of old oaks. "Dinner is at 7, Mrs. Polden said. Informal, while the household is small. His Grace dines alone most evenings but has asked that you join him." Cecilia blinked. "He has." "He has," Mrs. Polden's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted slightly, not surprise, not quite approval, but something between the two. "Is there anything you need before then?" "No, thank you." "Very well." She was almost to the door when Cecilia spoke. "Mrs. Polden." The housekeeper paused. "How long have you been at Ashford Estate?" A brief pause. 31 years, Miss Vane." "Then you knew the previous Duke?" "I did." "And the Duchess?" Something moved across Mrs. Polden's face, fast, carefully controlled, but there. "The Duchess passed when His Grace was 14. She was a very fine woman." "I'm sure she was," Cecilia said. "Thank you." Mrs. Polden left. The door closed quietly behind her. Cecilia stood at the window and looked out at the oaks and thought about a 14-year-old boy losing his mother, and a 19-year-old inheriting a dukedom, and a man of 31 who stood at his own front steps on a gray afternoon and looked at a stranger's ruined hair and asked who had done it like it was the only thing in the world worth asking. Outside, the oaks were very still. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed. "It does to me." She pressed her fingers briefly against the cold glass. "Who are you?" she thought, "and why does this house feel like somewhere I have been before?" She didn't have an answer. But for the first time since she'd sat down in that chair that morning and heard the scissors open behind her, she had something she hadn't expected to find here. She had a question worth staying for. She found the library by accident. That was what she told herself, at least. In truth, she had been wandering, carefully, quietly, in the way she had learned to move through houses that were not hers, since shortly after dawn, when sleep had become more effort than it was worth, and the ceiling of the East Wing guest room had stopped offering anything useful to stare at. The house was different in the early morning, stiller. The staff hadn't yet begun to move through it in numbers, and the light came in low and gray through the tall windows, touching things gently, the edge of a side table, the curve of a banister, the faded pattern of a carpet runner that had once been expensive and was now simply old in the way that certain beautiful things are allowed to be. Cecilia had pulled on her dress without calling for help. She had never been comfortable asking, and slipped out into the corridor with no particular destination. She had turned left, then left again, then through a set of double doors that were slightly ajar and stopped. The library at Ashford Estate was not a decorative room. Some houses had libraries in the way they had music rooms, assembled for the impression, dusted regularly, the books arranged by color or height and almost never touched. This was not that. This was a room that had been used consistently and seriously for a very long time. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, accessible by a rolling ladder on a brass rail that had been worn smooth at the grip. The books themselves were in various states of age, some clearly recent, some with spines so faded the titles had become suggestions rather than words. There was a large reading table near the center with 2 chairs angled toward each other, a lamp between them, and the particular comfortable disorder of a surface that gets used every day. Papers, a folded newspaper, a pen that had not been recapped. Someone lived in this room, in the way that people live in kitchens, functionally, honestly, without performance. Cecilia stood in the doorway for a moment, then stepped inside. She wasn't looking for anything. She ran her fingers along the nearest shelf the way she always did in rooms with books, lightly, reading the spines in passing, not selecting, just moving through them the way you move through a place that already feels familiar without knowing why. She was halfway along the second shelf when she stopped. The book was not remarkable to look at. Brown leather, moderate size, the kind of volume that could have been a collection of essays or a natural history or any number of things. What stopped her was not the book itself, but the name written on the inside cover. She pulled it from the shelf, opened it, and there, in a child's careful handwriting, the handwriting of someone young enough that the letters were still being negotiated, still not entirely sure of their own proportions, was a single line. This book belongs to C. Vane, and she is very particular about it being returned. Cecilia stood very still. She read it again. C. Vane. She looked at the shelf, pulled out the next volume, opened it. C. Vane, do not remove without asking. The next one. Property of Cecilia A. Vane. The A is for Augusta, which she does not tell people. Her hands were not entirely steady. She set that one down on the reading table and went back to the shelf, and began pulling books out in earnest now, not caring about the disorder, stacking them on the table one by one, opening each to the front page with the focused urgency of someone who needs to understand something before they can decide how to feel about it. 7 books, 8, 11. All of them. Her name in that same child's hand, varying in the particular ways a child's handwriting varies over years. The early ones labored and rounded, the later ones more assured, developing a slight leftward slant that Cecilia recognized, with a sensation she could not quite name, as the same slant her own handwriting still carried. These were her books. Not copies, not coincidence. Her books from her childhood, from the years before her father's death, from a time when she had been young enough to write her name in things with the absolute confidence of someone who expected them to come back. They were here, on the shelves of a house she had never visited, belonging to a man she had never met, in a library that no one had thought to mention, contained an entire childhood's worth of reading that had apparently been here all along. Hello. She sat down in one of the chairs at the reading table because her legs had decided, without consulting her, that standing was no longer a priority. Why? She might have sat there for a very long time if she hadn't looked up. The portrait was not large. That was perhaps why she hadn't noticed it immediately. It hung between 2 of the taller shelves, in a space that the morning light didn't quite reach, and it was the kind of painting that didn't announce itself. No dramatic scale, no ornate frame, just a modest oval of dark wood around a canvas that had aged to a warm amber tone. It was a woman. She was perhaps 30 in the portrait, dark-haired, painted in the style of 20 years ago, high-waisted, simply dressed, with the particular quality of stillness that portrait painters sometimes captured and more often missed entirely. She had been captured in 3/4 profile, looking slightly to the left of the viewer, with an expression that was not quite a smile but was close enough to one that you felt you had just missed it. Cecilia looked at the portrait. The portrait did not look back, because it was a painting, and paintings did not do that. But the woman in it had dark hair, and a particular way of holding her shoulders straight, not stiffly, in the manner of someone who stood correctly not because she'd been told to, but because it came naturally. And a jaw that was Cecilia stood up from the chair, crossed the room, and stopped in front of the portrait with her heart doing something irregular in her chest. The same jaw. Not similar, not reminiscent of, the same. Her hands came up involuntarily to her own face, then back down. She felt faintly ridiculous, but she looked again, carefully, the way you look when you're trying to be certain and not merely seeing what you want to see. The woman in the portrait had Cecilia's eyes, her jaw, the same slight asymmetry at the left corner of the mouth that Cecilia had looked at in mirrors her whole life and never been able to decide whether she liked. She looked at the small brass plate on the bottom of the frame. M. Vane, Ashford, 1809 *. M. Vane. Vane. Not a Harwick, not an Ashford. A Vane, her family name, her father's name, the name that Lady Harwick had spent 2 years making Cecilia feel was a liability rather than a birthright. A Vane had been painted and hung in this library. Someone had placed her here, between the shelves, where she would be seen every day by anyone who came to read. Someone had thought she belonged here permanently enough to commission a portrait and put a nameplate on it. And someone, at some point, had filled these shelves with a child's books and left them there. Who did that, she thought, And then, does he know they're here? She didn't hear him come in. That was the second thing she noticed about Edmund Ashford. He moved through his own house without announcement, without the particular self-consciousness of a man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around his arrival. She had been standing in front of the portrait for what felt like a very long time when she became aware, suddenly, that she was not alone. She turned. He was in the doorway, still in his morning clothes, a cup of something in his hand, looking at her with the same expression he'd worn in the courtyard, that focused, assessing attention that was not unfriendly but was entirely undisguised. His gaze moved to the table, the stacked books, the open covers. Something crossed his face that she couldn't read. "You found them," he said. "Not a question." "They have my name in them," Cecilia said. Her voice was steady. She was rather proud of it. "They do. Were you going to tell me they were here?" He was quiet for a moment. He came into the room not quickly, but with the deliberateness of a man choosing his words with the same care he used for everything, and set his cup down on the reading table. He looked at the stack of books, and then at the portrait, and then at Cecilia. "I was going to wait," he said, "until I understood more myself." "Understood what?" He looked at her steadily. "Why my mother knew your father," he said. "Why she kept your books. And why, when I wrote to ask Lady Harwick about it 6 months ago, she told me you didn't exist." The library was very quiet. Outside, somewhere distant, a door opened and closed. One of the kitchen staff, probably. The ordinary sounds of a house beginning its day. Cecilia stood in front of the portrait of a woman with her own face, and looked at a man who had known she existed for at least 6 months, and had, apparently, spent that time trying to find her. "She told you I didn't exist," she repeated. "She told me Sir Arthur Vane had no surviving children. And yet here I am." "And yet here you are," he said quietly, "which means someone went to considerable trouble to make sure I wouldn't look." He picked up one of the books from the table, opened it to the front page. Read the inscription with an expression she still couldn't entirely decipher, not sad exactly, but something adjacent to it, something old. "My mother died when I was 14, he said. "I didn't go through her things properly for years. When I finally did, when I found these, I asked my solicitor to make inquiries." He set the book down carefully, as though it was worth the care. "It took him 4 months to find your name in a parish record, another 2 to trace you to the Harwick household. And then you arranged for me to come here." "Your father's will arranged for that. I simply made sure the arrangement was honored." Cecilia looked at him. "Lady Harwick said it was my father's instructions that sent me here." "It was, though I suspect she had been hoping those instructions would remain conveniently overlooked." "For 2 years, Cecilia said. "For 2 years," he confirmed. She turned back to the portrait. M. Vane, her family, standing quietly between the shelves, watching over a library full of a child's books that had been kept here, carefully, by a woman who was gone and a man who hadn't known what they meant until he was old enough to look. "Who was she?" Cecilia asked. "M. Vane." "I don't know," Edmund said. "Not yet, but I think," and here he paused, in the particular way of someone choosing to say something they cannot unsay, "I think she may be the reason your father trusted mine, and the reason mine trusted yours, and the reason," he added, "that when I read the relevant section of your father's will, it did not surprise me at all." Cecilia turned to look at him. "What does the will say?" He met her eyes. "That you are to be protected," he said simply. "That you are not a burden to be passed along. That you are, and I am quoting directly, the best of them." The best of them. She had not heard those words before, had not known they existed, written somewhere in a document that had been kept from her for 2 years by a woman with a pair of scissors and a talent for convenient omissions. Her throat tightened. She did not look away. "He wrote that." "He did." She nodded once, slowly, Then she turned back to the portrait and looked at the woman with her own face and breathed carefully until the tightening passed. Behind her, Edmund said nothing. He simply waited, with the particular patience of a man who understood that some moments required room to exist in before anything else could happen. When she turned back, she was composed. "I'd like to read the will," she said. "I'll have my solicitor send the full copy today," he said. "And the books? They're yours, they've always been yours." He said it without hesitation, as though it had never been in question. They were only waiting. She looked at the stack on the table. 11 books. Her name in her own child's handwriting, written with the absolute confidence of someone who expected things to come back to her. They had. Just not in any way she could have predicted. The solicitor arrived on a Thursday. Cecilia knew he was coming. Edmund had told her, the morning after the library, over a breakfast that had been surprisingly ordinary given everything that had happened the day before. He had simply said, while reaching for the coffee pot, that Mr. Aldous Price would arrive Thursday from London, and that she was welcome to be present for the discussion, and that was entirely her choice. She had said she would be present. He had nodded, as though he'd expected no other answer, and passed her the coffee pot. That had been 4 days ago. In those 4 days, a number of things had happened, and none of them were the things Cecilia had expected. She had expected to feel like a guest, tolerated, temporary, careful not to take up too much space. She had expected the particular loneliness of being in a large house where you didn't quite belong, that specific social purgatory she had occupied for 2 years in the Harwick household, visible enough to be used and invisible enough to be ignored. Instead, she had been given the library. Not formally. There had been no announcement, no presentation of a key. It had simply happened, the morning after she'd found the books, when Mrs. Polden had appeared in the corridor outside the library door and told her, with the brisk efficiency of someone resolving a logistical matter, that His Grace had said the library was to be considered available to her at any hour, and that a writing desk would be moved in from the blue sitting room if she'd like one, and did she prefer the window side or the fireplace side. Cecilia had said the fireplace side. The desk had appeared within the hour. She had also, in those 4 days, dined with Edmund every evening. Formally, in the sense that it happened in the dining room with the correct number of candles and the correct sequence of courses. Informally, in every other sense, he asked her questions and listened to the answers, which was such an unusual experience that she had caught herself, on the second evening, pausing mid-sentence simply because she'd become aware that he was paying complete attention, and she had momentarily forgotten how to continue under those conditions. He had waited. She had continued. By the 4th evening she had stopped pausing. She was not sure precisely when she had stopped being afraid of Ashford Estate. She was only aware, on Thursday morning, as she heard the carriage on the drive and straightened the papers on her new desk and stood up to go downstairs, that somewhere in the past 4 days the house had shifted from something she was navigating to something she was simply in. It was a feeling she did not entirely trust. But she went downstairs anyway. Mr. Aldous Price was a small man, narrow-shouldered, with the careful posture of someone who had spent decades in rooms where precision mattered. He had gray hair, round spectacles, and a leather case that he carried with both hands, with the particular reverence of someone transporting something that deserved it. He shook Edmund's hand in the entrance hall. Then he turned to Cecilia, and something moved across his face, a recognition she didn't quite understand, a brief tightening around the eyes before he composed himself and shook her hand as well. "Miss Vane," he said, "I knew your father." "I gathered you might," she said. "He spoke of you often." He said it carefully, as though selecting the words from a longer sentence and offering only these. "Very often." She nodded, because there was nothing adequate to say to that, and followed them to the study. Edmund's study was a working room, maps on the wall, ledgers on the side table, the organized industry of a man who managed a large estate without delegating the parts he considered important. He had cleared space at the central table and arranged 3 chairs, which Cecilia noted meant he had planned for this to be a conversation between 3 people rather than 2 people and an observer. She sat. Mr. Price sat across from her. Edmund took the chair at the head of the table and said, without preamble, "Show her the document, Price." Mr. Price opened his leather case. What he removed was not a single document, it was 2. He placed them side by side on the table, smoothed them both with a careful hand, and looked at Cecilia over his spectacles. "Miss Vane," he said, "what I am about to show you requires some explanation before you read it." "Then explain," she said. He glanced briefly at Edmund, who gave a slight nod. "Your father came to me in the winter of 1821, Mr. Price said, approximately 8 months before his death. He was not well at that point. He knew the situation. He wished to put his affairs in order, and he wished to do so correctly." He paused. "He drew up his will in my office. I witnessed it personally. 2 additional witnesses were present, both men of impeccable standing, both still living, and both willing to attest to the document's authenticity." He touched the document on the left. "This is that will." Then he touched the document on the right. "This," he said, "is the document that was submitted for probate following your father's death in 1823, the document that was acted upon, the document from which Lady Harwick derived her authority over the Harwick and Vane households, and from which she derived her guardianship of you." Cecilia looked at the 2 documents side by side. Even from where she sat, without reading a word of them, she could see that they were not the same length. "They're different," she said. "Substantially," Mr. Price said. The room was very quiet. Edmund was watching her with that steady attention she had grown almost accustomed to in 4 days. Almost. She looked at the document on the right, the false one, the acted-upon one, the version of her father's wishes that Lady Harwick had apparently found acceptable, and then she looked at the document on the left. "May I?" she said. "It's yours," Edmund said, the same tone he'd used about the books, as though it had never been in question. She picked it up. Her father's handwriting was in the margins. That was the first thing that broke her, almost, the small notes he'd made in the margins of Mr. Price's drafted text, the small adjustments and additions in his particular cramped hand, the hand she had watched write letters and ledger entries, and once, memorably, an extremely firm note to a neighbor about a disputed fence line. She pressed her fingertip briefly against one of the margin notes and then lifted it and kept reading. The will was thorough. Her father had been a thorough man. The Harwick estate provisions were largely what she'd been told, though notably more modest than Lady Harwick had implied, which was interesting but not surprising. Various small bequests to old friends and loyal staff. A sum set aside for the maintenance of her mother's grave, which Cecilia had not known about, and which would require some investigation since she was not confident the maintenance had been occurring. And then, toward the final third of the document, she found herself. She read the relevant section twice. Then she set the document down on the table with great care and looked at the wall for a moment. "He left me to you," she said, not accusingly, simply establishing the fact of it. "To the Ashford family, yes," Edmund said. "To my father's care initially, when my father predeceased yours by 3 months. The guardianship transferred, Cecilia said. "To me, yes." She looked at him. "You've been my legal guardian." "Since your father's death, technically, yes. Though I was not aware of that until Mr. Price located the original will 8 months ago. Because Lady Harwick submitted a different document." "A document," Mr. Price said, with the precise diction of a man choosing his words for their eventual use in legal proceedings, in which the provisions relating to Ashford guardianship were absent, and in which the provisions relating to your future, your financial situation, your living arrangements, your prospects, were considerably less detailed. Less detailed, Cecilia said. Is that the professional term for it? A small pause. For the purposes of this conversation, Mr. Price said, yes. She looked back at the document, found the section again. Read it one more time, more slowly, paying attention now to the exact phrasing. Her father had written, in Mr. Price's formal language, with his own additions in the margins, that Cecilia was not to be treated as a dependent, that she was to have her own income from a trust he had arranged separately, the details of which Mr. Price would explain, that she was to have full access to her mother's personal effects, which had been placed in the care of the Ashford family for safekeeping, that she was, under no circumstances, to be. She stopped. Read the phrase again. Under no circumstances is Cecilia Augusta Vane to be used as a convenience for the benefit of others, disposed of as an asset, or made to feel that her presence in the world is conditional upon her usefulness to those around her. She is not a burden. She is not a liability. She is the best of what I manage to do in this life, and she deserves to know it. It was not legal language. Mr. Price had clearly tried, gently, to formalize it. The surrounding sentences had the careful structure of a trained solicitor's prose. But this section had been written in the margin first, in her father's hand, underlined twice, with a small star beside it, and Mr. Price had included it verbatim, because some things cannot be edited without being destroyed. She was not going to cry in this room. She had made that decision approximately 30 seconds ago, and she intended to honor it. The trust, she said, and her voice was perfectly level, which she considered a significant personal achievement, the one he arranged separately. Intact, Mr. Price said. Lady Harwick was not aware of its existence. Your father was careful about that. How careful? Careful enough that it has been accumulating interest for 2 years without interference. She absorbed that. And my mother's effects, the ones placed with the Ashford family. Edmund spoke, in the East Wing, in a room that was locked after my mother died. I didn't know what was in it until Price told me. A brief pause. I have the key if you'd like it. She looked at him. He was watching her with the same expression he'd had in the courtyard on the steps, that first afternoon, that focused, steady attention. But there was something else in it now, something that had not been there before, or perhaps had been there, and she simply hadn't been in a state to notice it. Something that looked, she thought, very much like anger. Not at her. Carefully, deliberately, controlled anger on her behalf, which was such an unfamiliar thing to be the recipient of that she needed a moment to identify it properly. Who else knew, she said. About the original will, Mr. Price said. Lady Harwick, her solicitor, who I suspect will find the coming months professionally challenging. Possibly her eldest son, though proving that will take more time. My stepbrothers. The eldest at minimum, the younger two possibly not. She nodded slowly. She picked up the original will again and looked at the margin note with the star beside it. Read it one more time. The best of what I managed to do in this life. She thought about the scissors, the morning of her departure, Lady Harwick standing behind her with that flat, efficient expression, cutting away something she had decided was inconvenient. She understood it now, with a clarity that was almost peaceful. Lady Harwick had not been afraid that the Duke would find Cecilia beautiful. She had not been performing some petty cruelty for its own sake, though cruelty had been a convenient side effect. She had been afraid that the Duke would find Cecilia legitimate. She had been afraid that the girl she had spent 2 years reducing to a dependent, borderless, documentless, stripped of everything that constituted a claim, would arrive at Ashford Estate and find out exactly who she was and what she was owed. She had tried to cut that possibility down to size. She had failed. I'd like the key, Cecilia said. Edmund reached into his waistcoat pocket and set it on the table between them without a word. She picked it up. It was small, old, slightly warm from his pocket. She closed her fingers around it. What happens now, she said, legally? Mr. Price straightened his papers with the air of a man who had been waiting for this question and had prepared for it thoroughly. Lady Harwick has, in submitting a falsified document for probate, committed an offense of considerable seriousness. The matter of your trust, your guardianship, and your mother's effects are straightforward to remedy. That is a matter of days, not weeks. The broader legal consequences for Lady Harwick are a matter I would strongly recommend pursuing, and for which the documentation is already quite substantial. And my stepbrothers, the household. That depends on what you wish to do. She looked at the two documents side by side on the table, the true one and the false one, the one that said who she was and the one that had tried to say she wasn't. Give me a few days, she said. Of course. She stood, picked up the original will, looked at Edmund. Thank you, she said, for finding me. Something moved across his face, not quite the composed distance she had grown used to, something underneath it, briefly visible. Your father trusted mine, he said quietly, and mine trusted yours. I was considerably later than I should have been. You didn't know. No, but I should have looked sooner. He said it simply, without drama, the way people say things they have already said to themselves many times in private. I'm sorry for the 2 years. She held the will against her chest, her father's handwriting facing inward, and looked at the man who had spent 6 months looking for a girl who had been told she didn't exist. You found me, she said again. That's what matters. She left them to their legal discussion and went upstairs. To the east wing. To the locked room. The locked room smelled of lavender and thyme. Cecilia stood in the doorway for a long moment before she went in. The curtains were drawn, heavy ones, dark green, the kind designed to last rather than to be fashionable, and the light that came through the gaps was thin and gray and fell in narrow lines across a room that had been waiting, patiently and without complaint, for someone to come back to it. She crossed to the window and pulled the curtains open. The room exhaled. It was not large, not a grand storage room, not a forgotten ballroom of lost things. It was the size of a comfortable sitting room, furnished simply, a writing table, 2 chairs, a low bookcase along one wall and against the far wall, 3 large trunks with brass fittings and her mother's initials pressed into the leather. E.V. Eleanor Vane, her mother, dead since Cecilia was 6, present in her life since as a series of half-remembered impressions, lavender and low lamplight, and the sound of someone counting hairbrush strokes aloud and losing count on purpose. She went to the trunks and knelt on the floor in her good dress without caring about it and opened the first one. Letters, hundreds of them, bundled in ribbon by year, her mother's handwriting on the outside of each bundle in a hand so similar to Cecilia's own that her breath caught. Beneath them, small personal items, a tortoiseshell comb, a pair of gloves worn thin at the fingertips, a miniature portrait of a man she recognized as her father at perhaps 25, painted before the years of managing an estate had settled into his face. The second trunk, books. Her mother's books with her mother's name inside them and occasional margin notes in the same hand, small observations, questions, the occasional firm underlined beneath a sentence she had apparently found worth marking. The third trunk. Cecilia lifted the lid and sat back on her heels. Children's clothes, small ones, a rattle, a pair of impossibly tiny shoes, and at the very bottom, folded carefully in tissue that had yellowed at the edges, a cream-colored blanket with a name embroidered in the corner in pale blue thread. Cecilia. Her mother had packed these things herself, had folded the blanket herself, wrapped the shoes in paper herself, organized the letters by year with the particular care of someone who was putting things somewhere safe rather than putting them away. She had known, Cecilia thought, whatever had happened, whatever illness or circumstance had come for her mother at the end, she had known there was a possibility she would not be there, and she had made sure that what she left behind went somewhere it would be kept. She had trusted the Ashfords with it. The Ashfords had kept it. Cecilia sat on the floor of the locked room for a long time. She did not cry exactly. It was more complicated than that, something between grief and gratitude and a specific, quiet fury at the 2 years during which she had been in the same country as this room and not known it existed. She let it be complicated. She sat with it until it settled into something she could carry, and then she stood up, smoothed her dress, and went to the window. The east lawn below was quiet. The old oaks were still. She would come back to this room. She would read every letter. She would learn her mother properly from the evidence her mother had left behind, and no one was going to take that from her. She closed the trunks carefully, turned the key in the lock, put it in her pocket where it would stay, and went downstairs to find that everything had changed while she was gone. She heard the voice before she reached the bottom of the staircase. It was a voice she knew in the way you know a sound that has been used against you, not loud, never loud. Lady Harwick did not raise her voice because she had never needed to, the particular social violence she practiced being the kind that operated most effectively at conversational volume. But it carried. It was designed to carry. Deeply concerned, Your Grace, as anyone who knew the family would be. Her father's final years were troubling. The instability was, well, I don't wish to speak ill. I simply feel it is my duty, as someone who has had her welfare in mind these past 2 years. Cecilia stopped on the landing. Through the half-open door of the front sitting room she could see a sliver of the scene. Lady Harwick, in traveling clothes, which meant she had come a long distance or wished to appear to have done so, seated in one of the chairs near the fire with the composed bearing of a woman making a social call rather than one who had arrived without invitation at a duke's estate on a Thursday afternoon. Edmund was standing. His back was partially to the door. She could not see his face. The episodes were infrequent at first, but toward the end they became more pronounced. Her father tried to shield her from the knowledge of it, naturally, which I believe only contributed to her own tendencies. Tendencies, Edmund said. His voice was flat. She could not read it. Toward fantasy, Lady Harwick said, with the careful sorrow of someone delivering bad news reluctantly. Toward constructing narratives. Her father encouraged her reading, you see, which was well-intentioned but perhaps not wisest, given the circumstances. She has a tendency to see meaning where there is none, to believe herself the center of situations that are considerably more ordinary than she perceives them to be. Cecilia stood on the landing and breathed slowly. She was not surprised. She recognized this, the architecture of it, the precise selection of words that could not quite be called lies because they were vague enough to be unprovable, the performance of reluctant concern from a woman who had rehearsed it until it looked like something genuine. She had watched Lady Harwick do this to servants, to neighbors, to her own stepbrothers when they displeased her. She had simply never been the subject of it on quite this scale. I have brought some correspondence, Lady Harwick continued. Letters from her father from the final year. I thought, in light of the current situation, that you should be informed as her guardian, as the man responsible for her welfare of the full picture. I would not feel right withholding it. A pause, the sound of papers. Cecilia looked at Edmund's back. Move asterisk, she thought. Turn around. Look at her the way you looked at me on the steps. He didn't move. She could not see his face. She could not tell what he was doing with the papers Lady Harwick had handed him. I appreciate you coming, he said finally. And Cecilia's stomach dropped. It was not what he said. It was the neutrality of it, the careful, uninflected politeness of a man who was not dismissing what he was hearing. She knew that tone. She had heard it used by every person who had ever decided to wait and see before committing to a position, which was another way of saying every person who had ever decided that the account of a woman with a title and a sitting room full of forged correspondence was worth weighing against the account of a girl who arrived with ruined hair and a travel bag. She turned and went back up the staircase before she could hear anything else. She did not go to the East Wing. She went to her room, the East Wing guest room, the room with the fire that was lit before she arrived, the room she had made the mistake of beginning to think of as hers. And she stood in the center of it and looked at her travel bag in the corner and did the arithmetic. It was not complicated arithmetic. Lady Harwick was downstairs with letters. She had called them correspondence from Cecilia's father. They could not be, because Mr. Price had the genuine correspondence, had been collecting it for months, and what Lady Harwick had produced would be the same quality of document as the false will. Plausible to anyone who didn't look closely, devastating to anyone who didn't know to look at all. But Edmund didn't know to look. Not yet. Not until Mr. Price told him, and Mr. Price had left an hour ago, and Lady Harwick had apparently timed her arrival with some care. And Edmund had said, "I appreciate you," coming in the voice of a man who had not yet decided. She looked at the travel bag. The sensible thing, the thing that every year of navigating the Harwick household had trained her toward, was to go quietly, to not create a scene, to leave before she could be removed, because leaving on her own terms was the only version of leaving that preserved any dignity at all. She had done it before, in smaller ways, in a dozen small rooms in a house where she had never belonged. She knew how it was done. She crossed to the wardrobe, opened it, looked at the dresses hanging there, the few she owned, the ones that had made the journey in her bag, plus 2 that Mrs. Polden had quietly produced from somewhere on the second day, the kind of practical kindness that didn't announce itself. She took one of her own dresses out, began to fold it. She is the best of what I managed to do in this life. She stopped folding, set the dress down on the bed, stood there. Her father had trusted the Ashford family, had trusted them enough to write it into a legal document, to put her mother's things in their keeping, to build an arrangement across 2 families and 2 generations that was meant to outlast him. He had planned carefully and thoroughly, and with the specific kind of faith that a person places in institutions and people they genuinely believe in. Lady Harwick had undermined it for 2 years. And now she was downstairs with forged letters, and Cecilia was upstairs folding a dress. She put the dress back in the wardrobe. She sat down in the chair by the window instead, the one she had taken to reading in, and she looked out at the oaks, and she thought very carefully about the difference between leaving, because you have decided to, and leaving, because someone has arranged for you to feel that you have no choice. She was still sitting there when the knock came. It was not Edmund. It was Mrs. Polden, which was in some ways more alarming, because Mrs. Polden did not make social calls. She appeared when things needed to be done and did them and left, and she knocked on doors only when the matter was specific. Miss Vane. Mrs. Polden. The housekeeper stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, quietly, with the precision of someone who had checked the corridor first. "You heard," Mrs. Polden said, "not a question." "Enough." Mrs. Polden looked at the travel bag in the corner, then at the open wardrobe, then at Cecilia with an expression that was not quite neutral. "I have been at this estate for 31 years, she said. "You mentioned," Cecilia said. "I knew the previous Duke. I knew his wife. I knew," she paused, in the careful way of someone approaching something they have not said aloud before. "I knew the woman in the library portrait, Margaret Vane. She visited twice when his Grace was young. She was," another pause, "she was very like you." Cecilia looked at her. "She had the same way of standing," Mrs. Polden said. "When she didn't like something, perfectly still, very straight, as though she was deciding something." "And what did she decide?" Cecilia said, "when she stood like that?" "She stayed," Mrs. Polden said, "every time." The room was quiet. Outside, the oaks were moving slightly in the wind now. The afternoon light had shifted to the particular gray gold of late autumn, the kind that lasts exactly long enough for you to notice it, and then disappears. "He's reading them," Cecilia said, "the letters she brought." "Yes." "Do you know what's in them?" "No, but I know Lady Harwick, and I know what she is capable of producing when she is frightened." "She should be frightened," Cecilia said quietly. "Yes," Mrs. Polden agreed with a warmth that was entirely unlike her usual tone. "She should." She looked at Cecilia for a moment. "His Grace is not a foolish man, Miss Vane. He is a careful one. There is a difference. Careful men can still be misled." "They can, but careful men also ask questions." She moved to the door. "He will ask questions." "I hope you're right." "In 31 years," Mrs. Polden said, with the quiet certainty of someone who has earned the right to it, "I have been wrong about him twice, both times about minor things." She opened the door. "Leave the bag where it is, Miss Vane." She left. Cecilia sat in the chair by the window as the gray-gold light held for exactly as long as it was going to, and then began, slowly, to fade. She did not touch the travel bag. She picked up her book instead, opened it to the page she'd marked, stared at it without reading a word. Downstairs somewhere, a door opened. Footsteps in the corridor, not Mrs. Polden's brisk, purposeful ones. Longer strides. Slower than usual, as though the person making them was not going somewhere specific but thinking while they moved. They stopped outside her door. A pause. A knock. She looked at the door. "Come in," she said. Edmund opened the door and stood in the frame, and she could see immediately that something had changed in the 2 hours since she'd heard his voice downstairs. Something in the set of his jaw, the particular stillness of a man who has been very angry in private and is now being careful about it in company. In his hand were several sheets of paper, Lady Harwick's letters. He looked at her, at the chair, at the book open in her lap. Then, very deliberately, his gaze moved to the travel bag in the corner. "You were going to leave," he said. "I was considering it." "Were you still considering it?" She looked at him steadily, less so. He came into the room, sat down in the opposite chair, the one that had been empty since her first night, the one she had become aware she was thinking of as his, which was a thought she had been carefully not examining. He set Lady Harwick's letters on the small table between them, face down, as though he didn't want to look at them any longer than necessary. "She said your father was unstable," he said. "Yes." "She said you had a tendency toward." "Fantasy, yes, I heard." He looked at her, from the landing. From the landing. A silence, not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that is taking stock of something. "Your father's handwriting," he said. "I've seen it, in the margin notes in the original will, in the correspondence Price has collected." He touched the stack of letters on the table without turning them over. "These are not his handwriting." The words landed quietly in the room. Cecilia looked at him. "You knew," she said. "Within the first page." "Then why did you—" She stopped. "I let her finish," he said, "because I wanted to understand exactly what she was prepared to say, and how far she was prepared to go." His jaw tightened slightly. "Now I know." She looked at the letters, face down on the table between them, a significant effort on someone's part, representing a significant underestimation of the man sitting across from her. "What did you tell her?" Cecilia asked. "That I would review the correspondence carefully and be in touch through my solicitor." "She'll come back." "She won't come back here," he said, and the quietness of it was more absolute than a raised voice would have been. "I've spoken to my estate manager. She is not to be admitted." Cecilia absorbed that. "And the letters?" "Price will want them. They are evidence of something he will find very useful." He looked at her directly. "I should have come upstairs sooner. I needed a few minutes to manage the anger. I apologize for the delay." Manage the anger. She thought about that. About a man who had read forged letters designed to reduce her to a liability, and had gone somewhere private to be angry about it before coming to find her, because coming to find her while he was angry was not something he was willing to do. "The bag," he said, looking at it again. "Were you going to tell me?" "I hadn't decided." "Where would you have gone?" She considered the question honestly. "I don't know, somewhere I wasn't a problem." He was quiet for a moment. "You said that once before," he said. "The morning after you arrived, in the corridor." He paused. "I've been thinking about it since." "It's a habit," she said, "from the past 2 years." "I know." He looked at her with the expression she had now seen enough times to begin understanding, not just attention, but something underneath it, something that had been building since a Thursday afternoon in a courtyard when he had looked at her ruined hair and asked a question no one expected. "I would like it to become less of one." She held his gaze. Outside, the wind moved through the oaks. The last of the gray-gold light gave up entirely, and the room went to the softer, warmer dark of early evening, the fire beginning to matter now. "So would I," she said. He found it at midnight. Cecilia didn't know that yet. She was asleep by then, for the first time in several nights, with the particular completeness of someone whose body had decided that enough had happened, and it was time to stop. She didn't know that Edmund had gone back to the study after dinner, after the conversation by the fire, after she had said "so would I," and meant it in ways she hadn't entirely mapped yet. She didn't know that he had sat at his desk for a long time with Lady Harwick's forged letters in front of him, not reading them but thinking, in the way he thought when something didn't resolve, turning it, examining it from different angles, looking for the edge he'd missed. She didn't know any of that. But Edmund knew that something was still wrong. Not wrong in the sense of unresolved. The legal situation was clear enough. Price had it well in hand. The forged will and the forged letters would be dealt with through the appropriate channels, and Lady Harwick's position would deteriorate with the particular efficiency of someone whose careful constructions had been built on a surface that turned out to be less solid than she'd assumed. Wrong in a different sense, a gap, something he was circling without quite reaching. The question of why. Not why Lady Harwick had done what she'd done, that was transparent enough. A falsified will, a suppressed guardianship, 2 years of treating a girl with a legitimate claim as though she had none. That was the arithmetic of a woman who had seen an opportunity and taken it. The motive was not complicated. The question was older than that. Why had his mother known Arthur Vane? Not known of him, known him, with the particular intimacy of someone who kept another person's child's books on her shelves and commissioned a portrait of the child's grandmother and placed it in the room she spent the most time in. That was not the relationship of professional acquaintance. That was the relationship of people who had trusted each other with something significant. With what? He had the letters Price had gathered, the formal correspondence between the two families, careful and proper, useful for the legal case but not. He had begun to realize the whole story. His mother had been a private person. What she kept formally was one thing. What she kept personally was another. He had gone through her private things twice already. Once at 14, overwhelmed and insufficient for the task, taking in almost nothing. Once 3 years ago, more carefully, when he'd first begun to suspect that the estate's history contained gaps he hadn't been told about. He had found the children's books then, had not at the time known whose they were. What he had not found, had not thought to look for specifically, was his mother's private correspondence. Not letters received, letters kept. He went to the East Wing at 11:30. His mother's rooms had been maintained since her death. That had been his specific instruction to Mrs. Polden, years ago, delivered without explanation because he didn't have one beyond the fact that it felt wrong to dismantle them. They were dusted and aired and otherwise left alone, and he had not gone into them with any real intention since his 20s. He went in now with a lamp and a purpose. The writing desk was where it had always been, in the corner by the window, a small elegant thing in pale walnut that his mother had brought from her family home when she married. He had sat under that desk as a child during thunderstorms, which she had permitted with the calm acceptance of a woman who understood that some fears are not worth arguing with. He sat in the chair instead now. Opened the left drawer. Papers, household records, old invitations, the dried remains of something that had once been a flower pressed between two sheets. He set those aside. The right drawer. Locked. He had not known it was locked, had not tried it in any of his previous examinations of this room, because he had not been looking for something specific enough to try every drawer. He looked at the lock for a moment, small, brass, old, and then went to the mantelpiece where his mother had kept a small ceramic dish of things that didn't have other homes. The key was there. He looked at it in his palm for a moment. Then he went back to the desk and unlocked the drawer. The letters were bundled in the same way Cecilia's mother's letters had been bundled in the East Wing storage room, by year, tied in ribbon, the outside of each bundle labeled in his mother's careful hand. 23 years of correspondence. He counted the bundles quickly and then, instead of starting at the beginning, went to the last year, the year his mother died. The letters from Arthur Vane were immediately recognizable. He had learned the handwriting from the margin notes in the original will, from the genuine correspondence Price had collected, from the particular way the letters formed that was specific to the man. A slight pressure on the downstrokes, a habit of connecting certain letters that was idiosyncratic enough to be a fingerprint. He pulled every envelope with that handwriting and set the others aside. 12 letters, from the last 2 years of his mother's life. He read them in order. It took him the better part of an hour. When he finished, he sat back in his mother's chair and looked at the ceiling and stayed very still for a long time. The letters were not formal. They were the letters of two people who had known each other for a very long time and had stopped performing for each other years ago, candid, warm, occasionally funny in the dry way of people who have survived enough to find certain things absurd rather than devastating. They had grown up together. That was the first thing he learned. His mother and Arthur Vane had known each other from childhood, neighboring families, early friendship, the kind of bond that forms before people are old enough to understand class distinctions or eligibility, or any of the other considerations that would eventually organize their adult lives around different centers. His mother had married his father. Arthur Vane had married Eleanor, my Eleanor, asterisk he wrote, who is everything I had the good sense to recognize immediately, and the poor strategy to propose to 3 times before she agreed. They had maintained their friendship across the distance of separate lives, separate households, the separate trajectories that marriage and children and estate management created. Carefully, correctly, with the propriety that the period demanded, but with a warmth underneath it that propriety hadn't touched. And then Eleanor Vane had died. And Arthur Vane had written to his mother with a grief so plainly expressed that Edmund stopped at that letter for several minutes before continuing. He had not known, until reading it, that people wrote like that a man of that era and that class would put on paper, to a trusted friend, the full and unguarded weight of losing someone. He read it twice, set it down carefully. Continued. The later letters were more practical. Arthur Vane's health, declining. His concern about what would happen to Cecilia, my Cecilia, who is 6 years old and has her mother's eyes and her grandmother's jaw and more intelligence than I know what to do with. His trust in Edmund's father, recently established. His growing certainty that the arrangements he was making were the right ones. And then, in the second-to-last letter, dated 4 months before Arthur Vane's death, 3 sentences that Edmund read 4 times. I am enclosing something I should have sent years ago, when it would have been less urgent and therefore easier to be sentimental about. It is a small portrait of Cecilia, done last spring. She is very serious in it, which is accurate, and very lovely, which is also accurate, and I find I cannot keep it somewhere it won't be found and kept properly. You always knew how to keep things properly, Margaret. I am trusting you with the best thing I have." Edmund put the letter down. He looked at the other contents of the drawer, the things he had moved aside when he pulled the letters out. There was a small portrait at the bottom. He picked it up. A child, perhaps 5 or 6, dark-haired, serious, with a directness in the painted eyes that was not common in portraits of young children and was entirely, specifically, recognizably, her. The same jaw, the same quality of looking at something as though she had decided to understand it fully before deciding what she thought of it. On the back, in his mother's handwriting, Cecilia Augusta Vane, age 6, Arthur's best thing, keep her safe. He sat in his mother's chair at midnight and held a portrait of a 6-year-old Cecilia Vane and understood, with the specific clarity that comes only when all the pieces arrive at once, everything. The books, the portrait in the library, the trust his father had extended without explanation, the guardianship written into a will as though it were the most natural arrangement in the world. 2 families connected across a generation by a friendship old enough to have survived marriages and grief, and the particular erosion of years, and distilled finally into one instruction, passed from a dying man to a woman who had honored it until she died and left it to her son, who had not known it existed, until a girl arrived in his courtyard with ruined hair and a travel bag. Keep her safe. He set the portrait down, picked up Lady Harwick's forged letters from where he'd placed them on the desk, looked at the ink. He had good eyes, always had. It was one of those attributes he'd never thought much about until it became relevant in specific ways, reading contracts, examining accounts, identifying the particular quality of a document that was not what it claimed to be. The ink on Lady Harwick's letters was dark. Not aged, not the brown-gray that ink became after 15 or 20 years, after the slow oxidation of time and air and the particular chemistry of paper. These letters claimed to be from 4 years ago, 5 in one case. The ink was dark. Fresh dark, the kind of dark that ink was when it had been on paper for months, not years. He had noticed it downstairs, reading them for the first time, had filed it away without acting on it because he had been managing the anger and had needed to do that before anything else. He had not mentioned it to Cecilia because she had enough to carry, and he had not yet confirmed what he suspected. He confirmed it now, holding the letters near the lamp, examining 3 of them in sequence. Months, not years. Lady Harwick had written these letters recently. Had written them, aged the paper somehow tea, most likely, or a mild solution of something. A common enough technique for a person who had proven themselves willing to falsify legal documents, and had arrived at Ashford Estate on a Thursday afternoon, with the timing of someone who knew a solicitor had visited that morning, and hoped the ground was still uncertain. She had been wrong about the ground. She had been wrong about him. And she had been wrong, most catastrophically, about what kind of man looked at a stranger's ruined hair on a Thursday afternoon and filed the question away for later. Edmund set the letters down. He sat for another few minutes in his mother's chair, in the room that smelled of her still, faintly, in the way that rooms hold the people who loved them longest. He looked at the child's portrait. He thought about a man who had written * my Eleanor and my Cecilia, and who had trusted the right people with both. Then he stood up. He had several things to do. He wrote to Price first, a note, not a letter, short and specific, sent with the first rider before dawn. The correspondence Lady Harwick produced is recent. The ink is inconsistent with the dates claimed. Examine under good light. I suspect you will find the same. Please add this to what you are already building. I would like to move quickly. The second thing he did was sit at his desk until the household began to stir at 6, writing something that was not a legal document and not a letter and not anything he had written before. He crossed out several beginnings, arrived, eventually, at something he thought was accurate, which was the only standard he held things to. The third thing he did was go downstairs to breakfast. Cecilia was already there. She looked up when he came in, and he could see from her expression that she had slept, that the particular exhaustion of the past several days had released her somewhat, that she was more present this morning than she had been in the chair by the fire last night. She had one of her books open beside her plate, the habit of a person who had eaten alone long enough to need something for company, and she looked at him over the top of it with the directness that he had stopped finding startling sometime around the second day. "You were up late," she said. "I found something." She put the book down. "What?" He sat, poured his coffee, set down beside her plate the child's portrait face up so she could see it. She looked at it for a long moment. "My father sent this," she said, not a question. "To my mother, 4 months before he died, with instructions to keep it somewhere safe." She picked it up carefully, looked at it, set it down again and looked at the table for a moment, and he waited the way he had learned to wait, in the way he had discovered she needed, not rushing past the moment but not drawing attention to it either, simply being in the same room without demand. "She kept it," Cecilia said finally. "In a locked drawer. I found it last night with her private letters." "What did the letters say?" "That your father and my mother grew up together, that they were friends for most of their lives, that when your father died he was trusting the right people with the right things." He paused. "And that the ink on Lady Harwick's correspondence is approximately 4 months old." She looked up sharply. "She wrote them recently." "Yes." "Can you prove it?" "Price can. I've already written to him." She absorbed this. He watched her do it, the rapid, precise way her mind moved through information, arriving at conclusions and then checking them, the way a careful person does. She would have been formidable under any circumstances, he thought. Under the circumstances she'd actually had, she had simply become formidable quietly, in ways that had not been convenient for anyone who required her to be otherwise. "The portrait," she said. "Yours it always was." She nodded. She picked up her cup. Then she said, without particular drama, in the tone of someone confirming something they have been thinking about for a while, "You're going to tell her." "This morning." "She'll come here." "No," he said. "I'm going to her. I would prefer to have this conversation in a place where she cannot later claim she was ambushed in someone else's house." He looked at Cecilia. "I would also prefer that she understands clearly that what is coming is not a legal inconvenience. It is a consequence." "You sound very certain." "I am." She looked at him for a moment. "What will you say?" He was quiet for a beat. "I thought about that last night," he said. "I wrote several versions." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper, which he set on the table between them. "I ended with 2 sentences." She looked at the paper, then at him. "May I?" "That's why I brought it down." She unfolded it. He watched her read. It was short. He had written a great deal and crossed out most of it because none of it was as accurate as the simplest version, which was this: "You cut her hair. That was your first mistake. Your last will be believing I wouldn't find out." She read it twice, refolded it, set it down. "That's all," she said. "That's all," he said. "The rest is prices." A silence. She turned her coffee cup in her hands once, twice, the small habitual gesture of a person thinking. "You knew," she said then. "In the courtyard, that first day, you knew something was wrong." "Not what, only that." "Because of my hair." "Because," he said carefully, "of the way you stood when I asked about it. You said it didn't matter, but you looked like someone who knew exactly what it meant and had decided not to say so in front of an audience." He paused. "I recognized it. I've done it myself." She looked at him. "You," she said, with a slight disbelief that was not unkind. "I was 19 when I inherited," he said. "There were a number of people who assumed that youth and recent grief were the same as weakness. I spent several years deciding not to say things in front of audiences and saying them privately. Eventually, he said, when I knew enough to say them correctly. She was quiet for a moment. Go, she said, say them correctly. He stood, picked up his gloves from the side table, then stopped. I'll be back by afternoon, he said. I'll be in the library. I know. He left. He was back by 2 o'clock. Cecilia heard the carriage on the drive and kept her eyes on her book for another few minutes, with the discipline of someone who had decided not to perform anticipation. Then she set the book down and went to the window. He crossed from the carriage to the house without looking up. His coat was slightly dusty from the road, and his jaw was set, and he moved with the particular deliberateness of a man who had done what he went to do and was now finished with it. He looked up once before he reached the door. He saw her in the window. He gave a short nod. She nodded back. Then she went to the chair by the fire and picked up her book again, because there would be time for the rest of it, and she had been in too much of a hurry about too many things for too long, and she thought that whatever was coming deserved the patience she hadn't always been allowed to practice. She had read 6 pages when he knocked and came in, and set his gloves on the table, and sat down in the opposite chair with the ease of someone who had been doing it for years rather than days. Well, she said. Price will have everything he needs by Friday, he said. Lady Harwick will have a formal notice by Monday. Her solicitor is already aware that the situation is unfavorable. And her sons. The eldest is implicated. The younger 2 are not. A pause. I have no interest in punishing people for the actions of their mother. She nodded slowly. What did she say when you told her? He looked at the fire. Very little, he said. She is a woman who understands when a situation has changed past the point of managing. He paused. She looked at me for a long time, and then she said, I should have sent her somewhere farther away. The room was quiet. She was afraid of you, Cecilia said, from the beginning, the day she cut my hair. She was afraid of what you were entitled to, he said, which is different. He looked at her. She was right to be. Cecilia looked at the fire. She thought about a pair of scissors, a cold bedroom floor, hair that had taken years to grow. She thought about a woman who had looked at a girl with a legitimate claim and decided that the most efficient solution was to make her smaller, quieter, plainer, less visible, less herself, before sending her somewhere she might be seen. She thought about arriving in a courtyard and being asked, immediately, by a man she'd never met, who had done that to her hair. She made one mistake, Cecilia said. She made several, Edmund said. One that mattered most. He waited. She thought that making me smaller would make me disappear, Cecilia said. She didn't consider that it might make me more obvious to anyone who was actually paying attention. A silence. It did, Edmund said, simply, without elaboration. She looked at him. He looked back. Outside, the oaks were still in the cold afternoon air, and the fire was doing what fires do in old rooms in old houses, making everything feel, despite everything, like something that could be managed, like something that had a center of warmth if you knew where to sit. She knew where to sit. She picked up her book. He picked up the newspaper. And they sat together in the library of Ashford Estate, in the comfortable and serious quiet of 2 people who had decided, without quite saying so yet, that this was where they were going to be. It happened quietly. That was the thing about Edmund Ashford that Lady Harwick had miscalculated most fundamentally. She had assumed that a man of his position would make noise. That consequence, when it came, would come with the drama of public accusation, the spectacle of a scene, the kind of confrontation that could be managed, deflected, or at least weathered by someone with enough composure and enough connections, and enough practice at making other people's certainty seem like bad manners. She had been wrong. Edmund did not make scenes. He made outcomes. The first thing that happened was a letter. Not to Lady Harwick, to the three families whose drawing rooms she occupied most regularly, the Pembrokes, the Ashworths, and the Countess of Merton, who had known Lady Harwick since girlhood and whose social endorsement had been, for 20 years, the primary architecture of her position. The letters were brief, factual, and written in the tone of a man sharing relevant information with people he respected. They contained no accusations. They contained only the established facts of the legal situation, the existence of the original will, and the name of Mr. Aldous Price, who would be happy to answer any questions. They were signed by Edmund Ashford, Duke of Ashford. The Countess of Merton sent her reply within 48 hours. She expressed, in the careful language of a woman who had not survived 60 years of London society, by being careless with words, her considerable surprise at the contents of his letter, and her intention to review the situation fully before drawing any conclusions. She did not extend Lady Harwick her usual invitation to Thursday supper. The Pembrokes did not respond to Edmund's letter at all, which was, in its own way, a response. The Ashworths sent a note expressing their confidence in Mr. Price's findings, and their hope that Miss Vane was well. None of this was announced. None of it was performed. It simply happened in the way that things happen when a man with a dukedom and a reputation for cold efficiency decides that something needs to be addressed, and addresses it without requiring an audience. Cecilia learned of the letters from Mrs. Polden, who had learned of them from Edmund's secretary, who had been up until midnight helping draft them. She went to Edmund afterward and looked at him across the breakfast table with an expression he was beginning to be able to read, the specific look of someone deciding whether to say what they were actually thinking. "You didn't tell me," she said. "I didn't want to ask your permission," he said, "and I was concerned that if I told you beforehand, you might feel obligated to ask me not to." She looked at him. "Would I have?" she said. "I don't know. You have a tendency toward not wanting to cause trouble." "I'm working on it." "I know," he said. "I'm working on not giving you reasons to feel you have to." She picked up her coffee. "The Countess of Merton," she said. "That was the right one to start with." "It was the obvious one." "Yes, but obvious isn't always what people choose." She looked at him. "You chose correctly." "I usually do," he said, without arrogance, simply as a statement of his own standard, the same way he said everything. "Eventually." She almost smiled. He noticed, he always noticed. The second thing that happened was Mr. Price. He arrived on the following Monday as promised, with the formal notice that had been referenced at the estate, and 3 additional documents that he laid on Edmund's desk, with the satisfaction of a man who had spent a career waiting for precisely this quality of evidence. The ink analysis, conducted by a document examiner of Mr. Price's acquaintance, a man who had spent 30 years doing exactly this kind of work for the courts, confirmed what Edmund had seen by lamplight in his mother's room. The letters Lady Harwick had produced were not 5 years old or 4 or 3. They were, at the outside, 7 months old. Most were more recent than that. The falsified will had been submitted to probate using signatures that, under examination, matched no living or documented witnesses of the period claimed. Lady Harwick's solicitor, confronted with this finding, had retained separate counsel within 24 hours and was currently demonstrating the particular loyalty of a man who understood that there were degrees of legal culpability, and he intended to occupy the lightest one available. The trust Arthur Vane had established for Cecilia, the one Lady Harwick had not known existed, had been accumulating for 2 years and 3 months. Mr. Price presented the figure with the slight uplift in posture of someone delivering good news they have been holding for some time. Cecilia was present for all of it. She sat at the table beside Edmund and listened with the focused attention she brought to everything, asking precise questions, requesting clarifications, twice identifying implications in the legal language that Mr. Price acknowledged with genuine respect. When the figure for the trust was given, she did not react visibly, which Edmund noticed and which Mr. Price attributed incorrectly to composure. What it actually was, Edmund had come to understand, was the particular stillness of a woman who had learned to process things internally before expressing them, because expressing them externally had not historically been safe. He had watched her do it for 10 days now. He understood what it meant and what it cost, and he had decided without saying so, because saying so was not the right instrument for it, to spend a significant amount of time making it unnecessary. When Mr. Price left, Edmund walked him to his carriage. When he came back, Cecilia was standing at the window of the study. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm trying to work out how I feel," she said. "I keep arriving at things that seem contradictory." "Such as?" "Relief and anger at the same time in the same measure." She looked at the lawn. "My father built something careful and thorough and good. He trusted the right people. He made the right arrangements." A pause. "And someone looked at all of that and simply decided not to honor it for 2 years while I was in the same house." "Yes," Edmund said. "I don't know how to hold both of those things." "You don't have to," he said. "Not at the same time, not today." She turned from the window. "When did you become so reasonable?" "I've always been reasonable," he said. "I'm simply applying it to a new situation." She looked at him for a moment with the expression that had no precise name, not quite a smile, not quite not one. The same expression he had looked at in the library portrait the first time he'd ever really examined it and thought, with a specificity that surprised him. "I would like to see this expression often." "The trust," she said, "is yours entirely and immediately." "I know I meant," she paused. "I'm not going to pretend I know what to do with it. I've been managing with very little for long enough that the concept of enough feels." She stopped, tried again. "Abstract." "It will become less so," he said. "Is that a promise?" He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and turned back to the window with the air of someone who has received something they needed and is going to sit with it quietly until they trust it. The third thing that happened was the ball. Not Edmund's ball. He did not host balls as a general principle, considering them an inefficient use of resources and an efficient source of people he had no interest in talking to. The ball was the Countess of Merton's, her annual autumn gathering, which she had hosted for 30 years and which represented, in the social geography of the county, the clearest possible signal of who was currently considered worth including. The invitations had gone out 3 weeks prior. Lady Harwick had received one she had accepted. The invitation to Cecilia had arrived 6 days after Edmund's letter to the Countess. Cecilia had looked at it for a long time when Mrs. Polden brought it. "I don't have anything appropriate to wear," she said. "Not a complaint, a fact." "Mrs. Polden has a suggestion about that," Mrs. Polden said, with the specific neutrality of a woman who had already arranged something. The suggestion turned out to be a dressmaker from the village, a woman of considerable skill and the particular efficiency of someone given clear instructions and a reasonable timeline. She arrived the next morning and spent 4 hours with Cecilia, and when she left she had measurements, preferences, and the understanding that this was not a commission for something serviceable. Cecilia had not asked who was paying for it. Edmund had not offered the information, because some things were not conversations, they were simply decisions, and this was one of them. The dress arrived on Thursday. It was the color of deep winter water, not blue exactly, and not green, but the specific shade that exists between them in the hour before dark, when the light has changed enough to make familiar things look like they've always had a second nature. The cut was simple. The fabric was the kind that moved correctly, that did what it was supposed to do without being told. Cecilia stood in front of the mirror in the east wing and looked at herself. Her hair had grown. Not enough, not back to what it had been, not to the length her mother had brushed and counted and lost count of on purpose, but enough that it had stopped looking like something that had been done to her and started looking like something she was choosing. She had pinned it herself, with the assistance of one of the younger maids who had a talent for it, and the result was not elaborate but was, she thought, entirely hers. She looked at herself in the mirror. She thought about a bedroom floor, hair on cold stone, a woman with scissors and a flat expression and the specific fear of someone who needed Cecilia to be less than she was. More appropriate, Lady Harwick had said. For what asterisk Cecilia had thought. She understood now. For this, for arriving somewhere she was owed, looking like someone who knew it. She picked up her gloves. She went downstairs. Edmund was in the entrance hall. He had his gloves in his hand and was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man waiting, which on him was indistinguishable from the expression of a man thinking, because he did both with the same focused stillness. He turned when he heard her on the stairs. He looked at her the way he had looked at her that first day in the courtyard, with that assessing, genuine attention that had no performance in it. "You look," he said, and then stopped. She raised an eyebrow. "Like someone who should have been introduced correctly a long time ago," he said. She came the rest of the way down the stairs, and now I intend to do it myself. The Countess of Merton's ball was, by the standard of county gatherings, significant, not London, not the scale of a season event, but the kind of occasion that mattered to the people who attended it, which was perhaps the more honest measure of significance. 200 guests. The Countess's house lit from every window, the drive lined with carriages, the particular energy of a gathering that understood itself to be the most important one of the autumn. Cecilia had attended balls before, during her father's lifetime, when she was young enough that attendance was charming rather than consequential. In the 2 years after his death, she had not attended anything. Lady Harwick had not considered it necessary. She noticed, as Edmund handed her down from the carriage, that her hands were steady. She was not sure when that had happened. They entered together. This was not arranged or announced. It simply was. Edmund had arrived with her, walked in beside her, and in the particular social arithmetic of a room that understood exactly what the Duke of Ashford's proximity signified, that was sufficient. She was aware of the shift before she saw it, the small adjustments of posture and attention as they moved through the entrance, the recalibration of a room that was good at recalibration. The Countess of Merton met them at the entrance to the main room. She was 80-something. No one knew precisely, and she considered precision on the point of failure of imagination, with the bearing of a woman who had outlasted enough fashions to know that bearing was the only one that lasted. She had sharp eyes and a reputation for complete accuracy in all her assessments, which meant people paid attention to them. She looked at Cecilia. Cecilia looked back. "Miss Vane," the Countess said, "I knew your mother." Cecilia blinked. "I didn't know that." She was a remarkable woman, very direct. The Countess's eyes moved over her with the efficient assessment of someone who had been making these judgments for 60 years. "You have her jaw." "So I've been told." "It's a compliment. Eleanor Vane had the best jaw in 3 counties. She offered her hand. "I'm glad you're here. It is long overdue." She moved on to the next guests with the ease of a woman who did not linger, having made her point at precisely the correct volume for the correct number of people to hear it. Cecilia looked at Edmund. "Did you arrange that?" she said quietly. "I have no influence over what the Countess says," he said. "Nobody does. It's her primary virtue." "You told her about my mother." "I mentioned the connection. She supplied everything else." She looked at the room. She was aware, peripherally, of Lady Harwick across it, standing with 2 women who were listening to her with the particular politeness of people who were not sure, yet, what the evening was going to establish, and were therefore not committing. She was also aware that Lady Harwick had seen her, and Edmund and the Countess, and had performed a small rearrangement of her expression that would not have been visible to most people. Cecilia had spent 2 years watching Lady Harwick's expressions. She saw it. She knows, Cecilia said. She knew before she arrived, Edmund said. She came anyway. That tells you everything about her that you need to know. She came to see if there was still something salvageable. Yes. Is there? No, he said, but she won't accept that until she sees it for herself. She almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The feeling lasted approximately 3 seconds, which was, she thought, sufficient. Introduce me, she said, to everyone you think I should know. He looked at her. Everyone. Everyone I've been missing for 2 years. I intend to be found. He introduced her to 31 people over the course of the evening. She counted. It became, at some point, a kind of private game, watching him navigate the room with the efficiency of a man who understood exactly who mattered and in what way, bringing her into conversation after conversation with the consistency of someone making a point without ever quite stating it. Not performing. Not announcing. Simply including her, repeatedly and specifically, in a way that left no room for any interpretation other than the obvious one. She held her own. She had not expected to be surprised by that, and yet she was, slightly, not at the ability which she had always had, but at the feeling of being allowed to use it in a room where it mattered. She had spent 2 years being useful in invisible ways, managing things that received no acknowledgement. This was different. She said something sharp about the new land legislation to a baronet who had not expected her to have an opinion, and then discovered she had a better one than he did. She listened to an elderly general's story about the Peninsular War with genuine interest, and asked the one question that made him straighten in his chair and say, "By God, nobody ever asks that." She made a woman named Mrs. Calloway laugh so suddenly, and so genuinely that Mrs. Calloway looked slightly surprised at herself. Edmund, beside her or nearby for all of it, said nothing about any of it in the moment. He didn't need to. She could feel it, not approval, exactly, because approval implied a power differential she was increasingly disinclined to maintain. Something else. The quiet satisfaction of someone watching a thing happen that they had expected to happen and are glad to have been right about. At some point in the late evening, she found herself standing near the window with a glass of something and a temporary reprieve from conversation, watching the room. Edmund had been pulled aside by a man who appeared to have an agricultural grievance of some urgency, and she was, for the moment, alone. She watched Lady Harwick across the room. The evening had not been kind to her. Not unkindly, no one had said anything direct, no scenes had occurred, no confrontations had been invited. But the Countess's introduction had established a fact, and facts in a room like this moved quickly. And by the middle of the evening, the 2 women who had been listening politely to Lady Harwick near the fireplace had migrated elsewhere. She now stood with her youngest stepson, who looked uncomfortable, and a couple Cecilia didn't recognize, who were being polite in the way people are polite when they don't yet know enough to be anything else. It was not ruin, not yet. Ruin was coming through Mr. Price's channels carefully and correctly. But it was the beginning of the particular social consequence that preceded ruin, the gradual, quiet withdrawal of the room's investment. The sense, spreading slowly through 200 people, that the arithmetic had changed. Lady Harwick looked across the room at Cecilia. Cecilia looked back. She did not look away. She did not perform anything, not triumph, not anger, nothing that would have made the moment about those things. She simply looked, with the steady attention of someone who was finished being managed, and held it long enough that the point was made, and then turned back to the window and looked at the garden instead. It was enough. It was, she had decided, sufficient. Edmund appeared at her shoulder. "The agricultural grievance," she said without turning. "Resolved," he said. In his favor, which he didn't expect, which is why it took 20 minutes. She smiled. You were holding out. I was gathering information before deciding. There is a difference. Is there? Yes, I've told you this. She turned from the window. He was looking at the room with the expression she recognized as his version of comfort, not quite at ease, because she was beginning to suspect that full ease was not a state he accessed often, but something close to it. The particular quality of a man in a place he knows and knows well. I looked at her, Cecilia said, Lady Harwick. I saw. I didn't feel what I expected to. What did you feel? She considered the question honestly, which was the only way she knew to answer things. Finished, she said. I felt finished with it, with her, with the version of things where she was the most important factor. Good, he said. That's all good. It's the correct response to the correct development. What else would I say? She looked at him. Most people would say something more. I'm not most people, he said, and it wasn't arrogance, it was simply accurate, and she had stopped expecting him to be otherwise. No, she said, you're not. The music was changing, something slower now, the kind of music that was an invitation whether you treated it as one or not. Around them the room shifted, couples moving toward the center. Edmund looked at the floor, then at her. I don't particularly enjoy dancing, he said. Neither do I, she said. Good, he said. Would you like to? She laughed genuinely, the kind that arrived before she decided about it, the kind she had not produced in a very long time in a room with this many people, and it surprised her the same way it had surprised Mrs. Calloway an hour ago, the sudden completeness of it. Yes, she said, I would. He offered his hand. She took it. They danced one dance and then stood near the edge of the room for the rest of the evening and talked about things that had nothing to do with legal documents or scissors or the particular social arithmetic of who was standing with whom near the fireplace. They talked about the books in the library, which ones he had read and what he had thought of them, which ones she had read and where she disagreed with him, which was in several places, which he received with the focused interest of a man who found disagreement more interesting than agreement. They talked about the east lawn and whether the oak nearest the house was diseased in the root, which Edmund suspected and had been meaning to have examined. They talked about his father, briefly, and about hers, and about the particular thing it was to lose a parent young and carry the gap of them forward into years they should have seen. They talked in the way people talk when they have stopped rationing themselves. The evening ended. The carriage home was quiet, not uncomfortably, but the quiet of two people who have said enough for one night and are comfortable not filling the rest of it. Cecilia looked out the window at the dark countryside and felt the particular tiredness of an evening that had been, in ways she hadn't entirely anticipated, significant. Thank you, she said. He didn't ask what for. He understood, she had noticed, the approximate shape of what she meant most of the time, which was one of the more disorienting things about him. You didn't need me there, he said. No, she agreed, but I was glad you were. A pause. So was I, he said. She turned from the window and looked at him in the dark carriage, the lamplight catching the edge of his profile, and thought about a Thursday afternoon in a courtyard and a question that had cracked something open in her before she'd known what was inside. Who did that to your hair? It does to me. She had not known then what kind of man said that. She knew now. She knew the specific weight of him, the particular quality of his attention, the way he moved through a situation with patience and purpose, and the absolute absence of performance. She knew that he was the kind of man who wrote 2 sentences when 20 were insufficient and found that 2 were better. She knew that he had spent 6 months looking for her without telling her that he had been looking. She knew that she was not the center of a narrative that had happened to her. She was the reason it had started. Edmund, she said. He turned. She hadn't planned anything. She hadn't constructed a sentence or a delivery. She simply looked at him and said the thing that was accurate. "I think my father was right about you." He held her gaze in the lamplight. "He only knew my father," he said. "He knew enough," she said, "apparently." A silence. "Go to sleep," he said quietly. "It's been a significant evening." "I'm not tired." "You are. You're just too interested in things to notice." She looked out the window again, tried and failed to be annoyed about the accuracy of it. "Good night, Edmund," she said. "Good night, Cecilia," he said. She was asleep before they reached the estate gates. He noticed. He said nothing about it. But he reached across and adjusted the carriage blanket before it slid, and did not move his hand back until he was certain it would hold. 1 year later, the oak nearest the house turned out not to be diseased at all. Edmund's estate manager delivered this verdict on a Tuesday morning in October with the particular satisfaction of a man whose opinion had differed from his employer's and been proven correct. And Edmund received it with the equanimity of someone who was right often enough to be gracious about the exceptions. Cecilia, at the breakfast table, did not say "I told you so." She said it with her expression instead, which Edmund had long since learned to read as fluently as text. "The oak is fine," he said, setting down the estate manager's note. "The oak," she said, "has always been fine." "You're not a botanist." "I didn't need to be." He looked at her over his coffee with the expression that had replaced, over 12 months, the careful assessment of their early days, something warmer, less guarded, worn in the particular way that expressions are worn by people who have stopped rationing them. She looked back. Outside, the October light was doing what October light does best, arriving at a low, honest angle that made everything look exactly like itself, no more and no less. The east lawn, the old oaks, the pale stone of the house catching it at the edges and holding it. It was, Cecilia thought, a very ordinary morning. She had not known, a year ago, that ordinary mornings were something you could want. She had not had enough of them to develop a preference. She was developing one now. Her hair had grown. Not all the way back, that would take another year probably, and she had decided she didn't mind. What it had done was cross some threshold between the thing that had been done to her and the thing she was choosing, and she had noticed the crossing without being able to identify the exact day it happened, which seemed right. The important changes rarely announced themselves. She wore it pinned most mornings and down in the evenings when the household was quiet, and she was in the library, which was where she could most reliably be found at 9 o'clock at night, in the chair by the fireplace, with a book and the lamp turned up, and the particular contentment of a person in a room they have fully inhabited. Edmund was usually in the opposite chair. They had not discussed this arrangement. It had simply become true, the way the important things between them had always become true gradually, and then completely, without requiring announcement. She had read all of her mother's letters by March. It had taken longer than she'd expected, not because there were so many, though there were, but because she had needed to read them in small amounts, the way you need to take strong medicine carefully, not because it is bad, but because it is significant and significance requires room to settle. Her mother had been, she discovered, extremely funny. This was not something anyone had told her. The few people who remembered Eleanor Vane tended to describe her as gracious, or lovely, or very fine, the vocabulary of people reaching for words about a woman they had mostly observed from a respectful distance. The letters were different. The letters were her mother at the kitchen table of her own mind, saying what she actually thought, and what she actually thought was frequently sharp and sometimes absurd and always more interesting than gracious. Cecilia had read one letter aloud to Edmund in the library one evening, without planning to. A paragraph in which her mother described a neighboring landowner's attempt to negotiate a property line dispute with such diplomatic incompetence that the dispute had become significantly larger than before he'd begun. Edmund had listened, said nothing for a moment. She would have found the situation with Lady Harwick extremely tedious, he said. She would have resolved it in a week, Cecilia said. Probably less, he said. I'm sorry she wasn't here for it. She had folded the letter carefully and looked at the fire for a moment. She was here for the part that mattered, she said. She put the things in the trunks. She trusted your mother. A pause. The rest of it she would have considered logistics. And the portrait. She'd have thought it was an excellent likeness, Cecilia said, and said so without modesty because she didn't have any. Edmund looked at her. You didn't either, he said, before it was taken from you. She had looked at him across the firelight. I'm getting it back, she said. I know, he said, I'm watching. Lady Harwick's legal situation had concluded in the spring. Mr. Price had been thorough, and the evidence had been complete, and the outcome had been, as he had predicted, unfavorable for Lady Harwick and her eldest son in the specific and lasting ways that falsified legal documents tend to produce. The Countess of Merton had been, by all accounts, unsurprised. The Pembrokes had continued to not respond to correspondence. The Ashworths had sent a note to Cecilia that was warm enough to be genuine and brief enough to be tasteful. Lady Harwick had left the county. Where she had gone, Cecilia did not know and had not asked. The two younger stepbrothers had written to Cecilia separately. The letters were awkward and insufficient and entirely sincere, in the way of young men who have understood belatedly that they missed something important while it was happening. She had written back, not warmly, not coldly, honestly, which was the only register she trusted anymore. She had also, in April, visited her mother's grave for the first time. Edmund had offered to come with her. She had said she'd like to go alone first, and he had said of course, and arranged the carriage and said nothing else about it. She had spent an hour there. She had not said very much out loud that felt performative, and her mother would have found it irritating. But she had sat on the grass beside the stone and read 2 of the letters, the funny ones, and felt the specific grief of loving someone you didn't get enough time with, and let it be what it was. The maintenance had been paid for, she confirmed. The arrangement her father had made had been honored by the Ashford estate accounts every year since his death. She had not known that either. She had come home and told Edmund, and he had looked at his accounts for a moment and said, "My father would have considered it a minor matter." "It wasn't minor," she said. "No," he said, "but he would have considered it obvious, which is sometimes better." The garden in October was the best version of itself, past the forcing ambition of summer, settled into the honest beauty of things that have reached their full measure and are not trying any more. Cecilia had taken to walking in it in the mornings, which was a new habit, acquired somewhere in the summer when the library had begun to feel, on clear mornings, like an argument against going outside. Edmund walked with her sometimes. Not always. He had an estate to manage and managed it with the focused attention of a man who took the responsibility seriously, and she had her own mornings, the letters, the books, a correspondence with a woman in London who was doing interesting things with a small lending library and had been glad to hear from someone who had opinions about it. She had her own hours and he had his, and they had the ones in between, which had always seemed to her, when she thought about it, like the correct proportion. On the 2nd Tuesday in October, he came to find her in the garden. She was looking at the oak, just to confirm. "The oak is fine," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I've heard. You look like you're auditing the finding." "I'm considering it." He stood beside her in the October light, his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the tree with the expression of a man prepared to wait as long as the oak required. Then he said, "I have something for you." She turned. He produced from his inside coat pocket a small box. Not a jeweler's box, older than that, the leather worn at the corners, The brass clasped the specific patina of something that had been opened and closed many times over many years. She looked at it, then at him. "Open it," he said. She took it, unclasped it. Inside, on a small square of faded velvet, was a miniature. The same one she had seen in her mother's trunk on her first day in the locked room, her father at 25, painted before the years settled into his face, looking out of the frame with an expression she recognized now as the origin of her own. But that was not what made her stop. Beside the miniature, on the same square of velvet, was the child's portrait. Her, at 6, serious and dark-eyed, with the jaw and the directness and the quality of someone who had decided to understand something before deciding what she thought. Arthur's best thing, his mother had written on the back, keep her safe. They were together in the box, her father and her, side by side, in a space someone had arranged deliberately for them to occupy. Your mother's box, she said. She kept them together, Edmund said. I found them that way. I thought, he paused, in the careful way of a man who has thought about his words and is now discovering that thinking about them was not the same as saying them. I thought they should stay that way, and I thought you should have them. She looked at the box for a long moment. You kept it, she said. After you found it, you kept it for months. I didn't know when the right time was. What made today right? He was quiet for a moment. The October light held steady, the oak stood unbothered by anyone's opinions, and somewhere above them a bird made a decision about the south lawn and departed for it. I thought about waiting for a more significant occasion, he said, and then I thought that was precisely the kind of thinking that had kept you from things you were owed for long enough. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the expression that had no precise name, not the careful assessment of the beginning, not quite anything she had a word for, something that had grown in the space between where they had started and where they were now and had become, without announcement, the thing she looked for when she walked into a room. Edmund, she said. Cecilia, he said. Ask me something. He looked at her. He understood what she meant. She could see him understand it. The slight shift in his expression that meant he was no longer gathering information but arriving at a decision. Will you stay, he said, not because you were sent here and not because it is practical and not because the alternative is unclear. He stopped. Started again, in the manner of a man who has crossed out several drafts and is working with what remains. Will you stay because you want to? Because this is yours, because I would. He stopped again. Because you would, she said quietly. Yes, he said, because I would. She looked at the box in her hands. Her father and herself, kept together in a space made for them, in a house that had been waiting longer than anyone had told her. I'm already staying, she said. I know, I wanted to ask anyway. Why? Because you should be asked, he said, for things that are yours to give, not assumed, not arranged, asked. She held the box carefully and looked at the man who had spent 6 months looking for her and never mentioned it until it was over, who had asked who cut her hair before he knew her name, who had crossed out 20 sentences to arrive at 2 and said them correctly, and then found a third. Yes, she said, Edmund, yes. The estate staff said, afterward, that they had known before either of them announced it. Mrs. Polden said she had known since the second morning, when Miss Vane had said the fireplace sighed, and the desk had appeared within the hour, and the way his Grace had said asterisk of course to something that could have been arranged differently. She did not say this to anyone who wasn't already going to agree with her. The locked room in the east wing was unlocked permanently, and the trunks remained open. Cecilia's mother's books found their way to the library shelves, beside the books with asterisk C. Vane written in the front, the early ones rounded, the later ones carrying the same slight slant her own handwriting still carried. The scissors were never discussed again. But in the bottom drawer of Edmund's desk, the locked one, the one his secretary knew not to open, they stayed. He had been asked once, by a curious young footman who had no idea what he was asking, why the Duke kept an old pair of household scissors locked in his private desk. Mrs. Polden, who happened to be passing, answered before Edmund could. "Because some things," she said, "are worth remembering correctly." The footman did not ask again. And in the library, in the chair by the fireplace, at 9 o'clock on most evenings, two people sat with their books and their lamp, and the particular quiet of a house that had been waiting a long time to be fully inhabited, and had finally, without drama and without hurry, become exactly what it was always supposed to be. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.